The story of the Canaanite woman coming to Jesus for healing for her daughter is one of my very favorite stories. There Jesus was. He had traveled to Tyre and Sidon, where most of the people were not Jewish. He was in a Roman district to try to bring back just the lost sheep of Israel. Then this woman comes up to him, not quietly, but shouting out her need. Her daughter was possessed by a demon, so she came to plead in front of this itinerant Jewish rabbi. Initially, Jesus doesn't even answer her, and then the disciples, irritated by her boldness, urge Jesus to just send her away. So he finally turns to her, telling her that he was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But her deep love of her sick daughter makes her persist, even when confronted by a band of his followers who just wanted her gone. Jesus the healer responds, not with welcome, however, but rejection. I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I wonder if at that point I would have just gone away, sad, despairing, at the force of his words. But this unnamed woman starts to literally argue with him. He counters her even more sharply then. It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Insult added to injury. She was not just likened to a dog, as we know, the pampered dogs that we might imagine or have in our own lives, but stray dogs who didn't even have a home. Yet she still persists. Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Finally, Jesus relented. Maybe to test her faith, maybe because he had deeply believed that his ministry of healing was to be just for the descendants of Abraham and Sarah. I believe that it is important to stop here to think about this for a moment. Jesus' initial response to her is a lack of any response, as this painting illustrates. As one biblical scholar posed, this could mean refusal or a test of her faith, but it could also imply hesitation as Jesus wrestles with dissonance between compassion awakened by the woman's plea and the knowledge of his primary focus on Israel. We are to understand that it is not at once clear to him what he should do. So which interpretation might you favor? That Jesus, fully cognizant of who he was from birth, was just testing her? Or on the other hand, perhaps Jesus did not yet understand the fullness of his healing presence to extend to all who were willing to accept it, even an unnamed Canaanite woman in a land firmly held by the Roman government. This first portrait I'm about to show shows Jesus not even looking at the woman as his outstretched hand pushes her away. We see no compassion, no sympathy, no connection, only dismissal. A very human and not very kind depiction of him as he keeps his back turned to shield himself from her pleas. In another encounter from the Gospel of John, in this painting, we see Jesus' hair perfectly coiffed, halo firmly in place, extending a gracious hand to the unnamed woman, healing her daughter. These two paintings illustrate two diametrically opposite understandings of the earthly Jesus. The earthly Jesus is still learning and growing. The heavenly Jesus from the very beginning was omniscient and perfect. I see these two contrasting understandings of Jesus in a couple of scenes from Jesus' youth. In the Gospel of Jesus, we see in the Gospel of Luke, we find the baby Jesus presented at the temple in Jerusalem by his parents. Then it was time for the purification offering as required by the law of Moses. So his parents took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. The painting shows a simply clad young couple bringing the young child in for a blessing. No angelic choirs, halos, or rainbows revealing him to be special. As you can see for the following translations, they differ immensely in what might be seen to be just a quibble about words. One says, "And the child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom." Another said, "The child continued to grow and become strong, increasing in wisdom." Then a third says, "As the child grew to maturity, he was filled with wisdom." They seem almost identical. Yet in the first one, it sounds as if this child, still breastfeeding, was already completely filled with wisdom. The others speak of how this happened as the child grew to maturity. But I personally favor the ones that lean towards seeing Jesus from this earthly scriptural encounter, learning and growing and changing, as those of us who are his earthly followers are compelled to do. With that in mind, let us turn our attention to the story from Luke's Gospel, where his family, along with their friends, traveled on foot from Nazareth to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. After the festival was over, the clan gathered to make their homeward journey. Yet Jesus' parents were not at first aware that the young boy Jesus was not with them. As soon as they found out, they hurried back to Jerusalem to search for him. There they found him sitting among the teachers, and everyone asking the questions as Luke records. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. I searched and searched for portraits showing him as somehow a precocious pupil, drinking in the learned answers of the elders to his precocious questions. But as this following portrait shows, he is at the center, looking much more like a teacher rather than an eager pupil. So again, did he know everything and was just revealing this? Or was he an eager young Jewish boy seeking to deepen his understanding of God? Then let's skip to the Gospel of John, the latest one written of the four canonical Gospels, to the wedding of Cana. The story goes that Jesus was there with his earliest followers when the wine stewards ran out of wine. His mother, accompanying him, sees this and goes up to her adult son and asks him to go to the empty wine containers and do something. "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." But his mother simply ignores him, instructing the servants to do whatever he tells them. Cornered, unwilling to continue challenging his mother, Jesus directs the wine stewards to fill the 6 stone water jars used for the Jewish rites of purifications with fresh water. Then when he tells the stewards to take some out of the jars, and the wine that was replacing that water was even better than the first. Here again, Do we view this scene as Jesus maybe testing his mother, knowing full well what his powers were? Or do we see him being commanded by her to make wine so that the festivities could go on as before? As I was musing on these instances of his presentation in the temple, of his going to Jerusalem to talk with the learned scribes and Pharisees, and also of this last thing in Cana, it seemed to me that this earthly Jesus was more consonant with how my own faith grew. I was baptized as an infant, confirmed as a teenager. My parents and I went to the Episcopal Church every Sunday, where my dad was a warden and sang in the choir, and my mother faithfully served in St. Margaret's Guild. So it was no surprise that I started my own theological ponderings as a young child. I clearly remember the stories of Satan after defying God being cast from heaven by the Archangel Michael, as illustrated by this painting by Ignacio de Reyes, a Flemish painter in the 1630s. This story began to conflict with my own emergent belief in an all-loving God. I began to wonder if Satan could still repent and be readmitted to heaven. But I took it a step further. When I was maybe 9 or 10, I started writing letters to Satan, asking him to tell God he was sorry. After I had written them, I hid them under the ink blotter on my desk in my bedroom. I didn't want anyone to find these missives. As yet, he has not responded, but my understanding of an all-loving God continued to grow. There's no place and no time, no one forever separated from my understanding of an all-loving God. Then I went to a private girls' school where we actually had to take religion as a requirement every semester. And then we were introduced to the complex doctrine of the Trinity and introduced to St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 proofs of the existence of God, which I'm not going to read here. They're quite lengthy. We were asked to do some sort of drawing or painting to illustrate this visually. And so I went home and very promptly, based on this triangle of the metamorphosis of the butterfly shows, I turned it into a triangle with the caterpillar and the larva and the final act of the beautiful butterfly emerging. And to me, I had just made the 6th proof of the existence of the Trinity. And yet, as I entered adulthood, I began to notice that the young man who had been baptized and confirmed along with me were able to keep advancing and learning theology and ultimately, if they were called, getting into ordained ministry. I seem to have hit the theological glass ceiling for women. It seemed that I, as a female, had reached the ultimate end of my theological learning and had to learn to accept my confined and limited role in a church that did not recognize or support the full gifts of women. It reminded me of the poem, A Work of Artifice, by Maurice Piercy, about the bonsai tree. Initially, the bonsai looks beautiful in its little pot, as the picture depicts, a work to be admired. But Piercy calls her poem not a work of art, but a work of artifice. Behind the scenes, someone is cutting and pruning and shaping the tree, trying so hard to grow to his own image of what it should look like. The bonsai tree here you can see is being trimmed by a man to fit his own preconceptions. And yet Piercy claims the bonsai tree and the attractive pot could have grown 80 feet tall on the side of a mountain till split by lightning. But a gardener carefully cut and pruned it. It is 9 inches high. Every day as he whittles back the branches, the gardener croons. It is your nature, he whispers, to be small and cozy, domestic and weak. How lucky, little tree, to have a pot to grow in. With living creatures, one must begin very early to dwarf their growth. The bound feet, the crippled brain, the hair in curlers, the hands you love to touch. I know how this has worked in my own life. I was born in 1945, right after the end of World War II, during a time which women had served in many capacities during the war. I'm sure you're all familiar of the famous poster, Rosie the Riveter. Women then, as needed, moved from their homes to help the war effort in building all sorts of machinery of war. And in the air, they actually became pilots and were put behind the windows of aircraft that were going into war. Some nurses, both in the Army and the Navy, actually were part of the Bataan Death March, who I'm sure most of you have heard of. And they continued there to serve as nurses until they were liberated at the end of the war. But however, when the war ended, they were expected to go back into their tiny little pots, to go back into their homes, to be happy and fulfilled as homemakers. Perhaps they might have a small outside job if it didn't conflict with what their duties were, as you can see from this picture of the Tupperware saleswoman. So I look back again in history to see other places where women were made to fit into some sort of a bonsai pot, but despite everything broke out of them. And the first one I thought of was Joan of Arc, who actually led the armies in France to war. And this picture here you can see her all dressed up in her finery, in her armor, ready to actually go to war hand to hand with the enemy. But not too much later, after she was captured and put on trial, you can see her being burned at the stake. The charges: witchcraft, heresy, and my favorite, violating divine law for dressing like a man. The charges read, this woman, utterly disregarding what is honorable in the female sex, breaking the bounds of modesty and forgetting all female decency, has disgracefully put on the clothing of the male sex, a striking and vile monstrosity. And then there's Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman in the United States to become a woman in 1849. You see a picture of her there. I'm sure no one ever accused her of dressing like a man, but I expect from my own experiences that being the only woman in a male-dominated profession brought her many daily challenges. Then there was Katherine Johnson, a black woman who worked for the NASA, during the space race, and who was a mathematician who calculated flight trajectories for Project Mercury and other missions. You can see their story in the film Hidden Figures. It's a fascinating biography of her and the other black women who, while facing overt discrimination, such as being segregated and getting less pay, made the space race a reality. This led inevitably to the astronaut Sally Ride, as this picture shows, breaking through the ultimate glass ceiling in her flight on the shuttle Challenger on June 18th, 1983. She was the first American woman in space. So all of these stories of women breaking the glass ceiling have been very nourishing to me and given me hope, and yet the churches, most of the Orthodox churches, the denominational churches, had a glass ceiling that they still kept in place for women trying to advance in ministry. Just an example, going back to the gospel, Mary Magdalene was the only woman who was at all four of the resurrection scenes in the four canonical gospels. She was initially called by the church the Apostle of the Apostles, as you can see in this painting. Here she is over the other apostles, having just told them about the miracle of the resurrection. And yet, as the church advanced and became more hierarchical and male-dominated, after her death, they decided that when Luke was referring to the 7 demons that Jesus cast out of her, she actually must have been a prostitute. And then she was a reformed prostitute, as you can see from this Renaissance sculpture by Donatello. And there she stayed until the 20th century, when the church finally gave her back her title. And yet, there were women that had been called into ordained ministry that had not yet been. So, a date that is so powerful that women in the Episcopal Church stepped forward. They were qualified and yet blocked. But on July 29th, 1974, this group of powerful women known as the Philadelphia 11 were ordained according to the apostolic tradition by bishops. And it was 2 more years before they were actually allowed to be accepted in that ministry. So just to pull this all together now, we've gone a long way from that Canaanite woman demanding that her daughter be healed. But I maintain Jesus still had a lot to learn. She challenged him to grow, just as his own mother did at the wedding of Cana. And I believe strongly that our baptism, our confirmation, no matter what gender, is just the beginning of our growing into the fullness of our own lives as faithful followers of Jesus. So, my last words: run like hell whenever you see someone coming at you with pruners. You are meant to grow into your own unique shape, as God is always calling you to be bigger and more beautiful.